Assalamu alaikum students, welcome back to Prose 2. This is your ENG503 paper, and the story that we're going to be dealing with today is Xing a Paragrab. Now some of you might think that this is a very strange title, but I'm going to explain to you what the title stands for and what this short story is about. But let me go back a bit and discuss with you what we've been doing so far. In this Prose 2 module, in the very beginning, we divided it into two sections, one dealing with the travelogue, that is Gulliver's Travels, and the other with short stories. And for those of you who were paying attention in the first half of the subject, we discussed the first voyage of Lemuel Gulliver, which was to the land of the Lilliputians. And there were certain aspects that we discussed of Swift's writing style, and I also pointed out that Swift's purpose in writing this travelogue was to, in some way, reform contemporary society. When we start dealing with short stories, we find that although the short story had its origin in England with Sir Walter Scott, yet for a few decades there was no work being done in England as far as the short story was concerned. And it is not until the 1880s, with Robert Louis Stevenson starting to write, that you have any work being done on the short story in England. But across the continent, in France, even in Russia, there was work that was being done in the short story. And as far as Russia is concerned, you know that and Anton Chekhov was the one whose contribution to the short story cannot be minimized. He did a lot of work, and to this day there are only two forms that are very prevalent, and one of these is the Chekhovian form. The other is the event plot story. So the Russian short story, in that sense, had a very strong impact on the English short story writing. In the same way, in France, Flaubert and Maupassant did a lot of work in this form of literature. Across the ocean, in the United States, a lot of work was being done as far as short story writing was concerned. There were some great short story writers, of whom Edgar Allan Poe is one. We've discussed a number of short stories written by Poe. Eleanora was one. A Descent into the Maelstrom was another. You had The Black Cat, and you had The Gift of the Magi. The one that we're going to do today is Xing a Paragrab. And when you're reading through this text, when you watch the slides that I'm going to be showing you, I want you to keep a couple of things in your mind. One is that a short story is complete. It is, as the name implies, short. It is a narrative that can be read in one sitting. You can't do that with a novel. You can't even do that with poetry, especially some of the long poems. If you have read Prelude, if you have read Spenser's Fairy Queen, if you have read Milton's Paradise Lost, and I'm sure you must have, you will know that these poems cannot be read in one sitting. The best thing about a short story is that it's complete in itself. It has action, it has characters, but unlike the novel, the characters do not grow, they do not develop. you see one aspect of the character because that is all that you can show or all that you can perceive in one sitting. So as far as that goes, you see that there's a lot of work that Poe has done, and each short story, you will notice, has a different theme. It has a style that sets it apart from the other short stories, not just those written by other writers, but also those written by Poe himself. Eleonora, he deals with a love story. The Black Cat is a story that has a combination of superstition, mystery, suspense. A Descent into the Maelstrom is sheer suspense. It's a story that describes action that is almost like walking on a tightrope. Then you had The Gift of the Magi, which has a sort of biblical background, but the theme that is used is very contemporary. The characters are contemporary. Just the idea of the Magi bringing gifts has been borrowed from the Bible. The same way, when you come to Xing a paragraph, you see that you will not be able to find these two words in the dictionary. You won't find Xing, you will not find paragraph. What you will find is crossing, and that's what the X means, and paragraph. Now, when you talk about Xing, you can, if it's easy for you, you can refer to it as crossing a paragraph. But again, let's see what is shown to us in this story, and I'll explain various aspects as we proceed with the text of the story. So Edgar Allan Poe, the writer of mystery and suspense and romance, is now trying his hand at a slightly different short story. So let's see what Xing a paragraph has for us. Okay? As it is well known that the wise men came from the east. Now I want to relate this story to the previous story. When we were doing the gift of the Magi, the wise men who brought gifts of gold, frankincense and myrrh for the Christ child came from the east, and that is the reference that Poe is giving here also. So he says that everyone knows that the wise men or the kings came from the east, and as Mr. Touch and Go Bullethead came from the east, it follows that Mr. Bullethead was a wise man. Now here is where you might have a difference of opinion. We in this day and age give a lot of attention and a lot of importance to knowledge and information that comes from the West. So we say that this research is being done in the West, so it's good. This project or this object comes from the West, therefore it is good. But things have not always been the same. The East has been a land of mystery, but that is a stereotype that has been given a lot of importance. And with the arrival of the wise men from the East, you have another stereotype being established, and that is the wisdom of the East. And when we talk about the East, we're talking about the Eastern Hemisphere. You know that the world is divided into the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. The world being like a circle is comprises of two halves, the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. So people who live in the West have a stereotype of all wisdom coming from the East. And you have great philosophers and poets of the East. You have the great Chinese philosopher Confucius, for example. You have the great Persian poet Sheikh Sadi, who is looked upon not just as a poet but as a poet philosopher. So with all that wisdom coming from the East, Poe says that Mr. Touch and Go Bullet Head, and look at the names that he's giving to his characters. Touch and Go Mr. Bullet Head. He says because he came from the East, therefore it figures that he was a wise man. And if collateral proof of the matter be needed, here we have it. Mr. B, that is Mr. Touch and Go Bullet Head, was an editor. Now Poe, you have to remember, was a writer. And for writers, editors are gods. Editors have a lot of authority. If they want to cut anything from your work, they will go ahead and do it. If they want you to rewrite, you have to do it again. So when the narrator says that Mr. Bullethead, that is Mr. Touch and Go Bullethead, was an editor, this is supposed to be the supreme sign of wisdom. The supreme sign of wisdom is that Mr. Bullethead came from the East. So because he came from the East, therefore he was a wise man. And of course, because he was an editor, that sort of puts the seal on his wisdom. Irascibility was his sole foible, for in fact the obstinacy of which men accused him was anything but his foible, since he just considered it his forte. It was his strong point, his virtue. And it would have required all the logic of a Brownson to convince him that it was anything else. So there was no way that you could convince him that he should be accommodating. He was not. He was an irascible person, and he thought that that was his strongest point. It was not a weakness in him the way you would consider it in another human being. I have shown that Touch and Go Bullethead was a wise man, and the only occasion on which he did not prove infallible was when, abandoning that legitimate home for all wise men, that is the East, he migrated to the city of Alexander the Greatonopolis, or some place of a similar title out west. Now this city, Alexander the Greatonopolis, is irony, since Alexander the Great is supposed to have the maximum number of cities named after him. That is what Poe and the narrator are referring to. You know that there are dozens of cities in the world that are called Alexandria. Wherever Alexander went, there was a city named after him that was called Alexandria. So you'd have Alexandria in Australia, you'd have Alexandria in Asia, you'd have Alexandria in Europe, and of course you have countless Alexandrias in the United States. So he is being ironic when he calls this city Alexander the Greatonopolis. It's a bit of a tongue twister, you know. Try saying this to yourself. Alexander the Greatonopolis. Alexander the Greatonopolis. It takes a bit of doing. I had to practice also. So anyway, he comes to the West, to a city whose name Poe does not give us. He gives us a hypothetical name, and he says that this city was called Alexander the Great Annapolis. And this, he says, is the only time that Mr. Touch and Go Bullethead, or Mr. B as he calls him, showed lack of wisdom. He's supposed to be a wise man because he comes from the East, because he's an editor. But his sole mistake was when he left the wisdom of the East and he came to the West, to this city. Okay, so I must do him the justice to say, however, that when he made up his mind finally to settle in that town, it was under the impression that no newspaper existed in that particular section of the country. And because you had no newspaper, therefore there was no editor. Remember, Mr. Bullethead was an editor. So the writer, the narrator, says that about the only time when Mr. Bullethead showed lack of wisdom was when he decided to leave the West, when he decided to leave the East and come and settle in the West. And he did that because he was under the impression that the town had no newspaper and therefore no editor. And so when he decided to make his life in this city, it was because there was no newspaper, and since he was an editor, the first thing that he wanted to do was to publish a newspaper. So what did he do? In establishing the teapot, he expected to have the field all to himself. Now here's something that you have to understand. The editor of a newspaper is very different from the editor of a book or a journal or a magazine. The editor of a newspaper has a lot of authority because he's the one who's finally going to decide what goes where in a newspaper and whether anything has a place in the newspaper or not. So he says that by establishing the teapot, what Mr. Bullethead was hoping to have and what he thought he was going to have was the town to himself. But that was where he was disappointed, because the narrator says, I feel confident he never would have dreamed of taking up his residence in the Alexander the Great Annapolis had he been aware that in Alexander the Great Annapolis there lived a gentleman named John Smith, who for many years had there quietly grown fat in editing and publishing the Alexander the Great Annapolis Gazette. And when he abbreviates it, he calls it the Gazette, because it's a little difficult to say the Alexander the Great Annapolis Gazette each time. So he calls it the Gazette. Now, where Mr. Bullethead, let's say, messed up, or where he made a mistake, was that he did not try to find out for sure whether there was a newspaper in town or not. So he comes and he starts off a paper that he publishes under the name of the Teapot. But he finds that in this town there is already a newspaper that is being published. The editor is John Smith, and the newspaper is called the Alexander the Great Annapolis Gazette. So that's the only mistake that he makes, and everything else arises out of that mistakes. So he says it was solely therefore on account of having been misinformed that Mr. Bullethead found himself in Alex, suppose we call it Nopolis for short, but as he did find himself there, he determined to keep up his characters for firmness and remain. So once he came to the town and he found out that another person by the name of John Smith was already publishing a newspaper, he was a little confused at first, and he didn't know what to do, because his information had been that the town has no newspaper. So he stayed, and not only did he stay, but he unpacked all the stuff that he had brought, his press, his type, etc., etc. And then he rented an office exactly opposite to that of the Gazette, and on the third morning after his arrival issued the first number of the Alexan or the Nopolis teapot. As nearly as I can recollect, this was the name of the new paper. So the Alexander the Great Nopolis teapot. The first paper that had been taken out by Mr. John Smith was called the Alexander the Great Nopolis Gazette. The one that Mr. Bullethead publishes is called the Alexander the Great Nopolis Teapot. What a name for a newspaper. The leading article was brilliant, not to say severe. It was especially bitter about things in general. Remember, Mr. Bullethead is new in town, so there are a lot of things that he finds strange or that he finds should not have been there. It was especially bitter about things in general, and as for the editor of the Gazette, he was torn all to pieces in particular. So as far as the editor of the Gazette was concerned, he was chopped to pieces, very fine pieces, for the purposes of the teapot. Some of Bullethead's remarks were really so fiery that I have always been forced to look upon John Smith, who is still alive, in the light of a salamander. You know, some of the remarks that Mr. Bullethead made about Mr. Smith could have set fire to Mr. John Smith. And the only reason it did not set fire to Mr. John Smith was because the writer says that Mr. John Smith is like a salamander. How many of you know what a salamander is like? Or what is it? A salamander is a lizard. It's a lizard that that is found in the heart of the fire, in the middle of the fire. Fire does not have any effect on it. In fact, the salamander seems to thrive on fire. So other insects, other creatures, the fire would burn, but it has no influence on the salamander. So the narrator says that some of the remarks were so fierce, were so fiery, that he always thinks that Mr. John Smith was in the position of a salamander, because all that fire coming at him appeared to have no effect on him. I cannot pretend to give all the teapot's paragraphs verbatim, but one of them runs thus, and therefore he gives the example of the kind of writing that Mr. Bullethead was doing. This is one small paragraph. So he starts off and he says, "Oh yes, oh we perceive, oh no doubt, the editor over the way is a genius. Oh my, oh goodness gracious, what is this world coming to? Oh tempora, oh Moses." So you see what he did? He has put together a lot of O's. Each O has a different meaning, a different purpose. But this paragraph was so caustic, he says, and so classical, it alighted like a bombshell among the hitherto peaceful citizens of Naples. So he says that the remark was so full of fire, it was so strange that the peaceful citizens of this small town, they just woke up with a start and started wondering what had happened. Groups of excited individuals gathered at the corners of the streets. This is what village people do because they have no other place to go to. Everyone awaited with heartfelt anxiety the reply of the dignified Smith. So, Poe will now give you what that reply was. Next morning it appeared as follows. We quote from the teapot of yesterday the subjoined paragraph, "Oh yes, oh we perceive," etc., etc., etc. "Oh Moses." The narrator says, "Why, the fellow is all oh." That accounts for his reasoning in a circle and explains why there is neither beginning nor end to him nor to anything, he says. And of course here he's referring to the fact that an O is a circle. A circle has no beginning and therefore no end. Because it doesn't have a beginning and end, it doesn't have a middle either. So when Mr. John Smith gives his opinion of the article in the newspaper, he says that this man has only the letter O in his typewriter, and so he puts in an O wherever it is required. And John Smith thinks that this man is mad because he's put an O in every word that he uses. So we really do not believe, and this is what John Smith has written in response to that small paragraph in the teapot. He says, "We really do not believe the vagabond can write a word that hasn't an O in it." A very big challenge. Wonder if this owing is a habit of his. And there is a pun upon the word owing. It's the letter O, and yet it can also be an OWE, and that means that you have to pay someone for something. So he says, I wonder if this owing is a habit. I wonder if Mr. Bullethead is in the habit of borrowing money from people. So he says he came from the down east in a great hurry. Wonder if he owes as much there as he does here. So still continuing with the pun upon the word, he says he's come from the east, and it is just possible that he had borrowed money from someone, and because he could not return that money, he owed that money. Therefore, he has come to the west, where he will be so far away that none of his creditors will be able to approach him and to ask for their money. So he plays upon the word, he puns upon the word and says, oh, it is pitiful. So John Smith retaliates. Now, what happens when Mr. Bullethead reads this paragraph? His indignation at the scandalous insinuations cannot be described. So this is what Mr. Bullethead comes up with. He says that it is scandalous what he has said about me. He has no proof that I owe money to someone else. I do not owe money. So he becomes very angry, and he decides to respond to this paragraph that Mr. John Smith has written, because he thinks that his integrity is compromised. People will not take him seriously if everyone makes fun of whatever it is that that John Smith is saying. So he says he would soon let the jackanapes see that he was mistaken. Yes, he would let him see how much he was mistaken, the puppy. He, touch-and-go Bullethead of Frog Pondium, would let Mr. John Smith perceive that he, Bullethead, could indict, if it so pleased him, a whole paragraph, a whole article, in which that contemptible vowel, that is O, should not once, not even once, make its appearance. So let's go back to the previous slide. He says Mr. John Smith's response is very, very harsh, and he says that if I just take one letter out of what he has written, then there is no limit to the number of O's that he has used, and there's a pun upon the word, and he says, I don't know how many people he owes money to, since he came out west in a hurry and without winding things up properly. So he says, and this is Mr. Smith's idea, that perhaps Mr. Bullethead cannot write even a single paragraph without an O. But no, that would be yielding a point to the said John Smith. So Mr. Bullethead says that this is ridiculous. I can write without an O, but I'm not going to give John Smith the satisfaction that I have stopped using O's because of his objection. So he says, if I stop using O's, that's going to be my inclination. It's not because you and I or a third person has told us to. It's going to be because I can prove that wherever I'm using O, it is very, very necessary. So if I'm using it 10 times in a single sentence, I have a reason for everything. So he says, I'm going to continue using the O. Burning with the chivalry of his determination, the great touch-and-go in the next teapot came out merely with this simple but resolute paragraph in reference to this unhappy affair. So he says, I'm not going to do away with O altogether. If he doesn't like it, he can just stop listening to it. But what happened is that the editor of the teapot has the honor of advising the editor of the Gazette that he will take an opportunity in tomorrow morning's paper of convincing him, that is the Gazette, that he, that is the teapot, both can and will be his own, master. And he will also he will also show the Gazette the supreme and indeed the withering contempt with which the criticism of the Gazette inspires the independent bosom of him, that is the teapot, by composing for that special gratification a leading article of some extent in which the beautiful vowel, the emblem of eternity, shall most certainly not be avoided by the Gazette's most obedient, humble servant, So he says that the O is the symbol of eternity because it has no beginning, no end. It has no middle. Each part of this newspaper is super sensitive as far as hurt feelings, emotions, and sentiments are concerned. In fulfillment of the dark threat thus darkly intimated rather than decidedly enunciated, the great bullet head, turning a deaf ear to all entreaties for copy and simply requesting his foreman to go to the devil when he assured him that it was high time to go to press, turning a deaf ear to everything. I say the great bullet head sat up until daybreak, consuming that oil because he was busy in putting the final touches to the piece of writing. Okay, now in newspaper publishing, there is a time when the newspaper has to go to press. There are people who are involved in this entire process, and what happens normally is that newspapers are sent to the press in the middle of the night, around 12, 1 o'clock. The news is finalized and the paper is sent to the press so that by 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning the newspaper is ready and it can thus be distributed to those different places where the newspaper boys get their newspapers and then they go and deliver to the houses. So when you get your newspaper at 6 o'clock in the morning, you know that it must have been ready by about midnight or 1 o'clock for it to reach your house at 6 o'clock. Okay? Now, when Mr. Bullethead starts to compose a paragraph in response to what Mr. John Smith has written, it takes him a long time. And although his foreman keeps on saying that he needs to put that paragraph in the press, he says, don't disturb me, I have to make this final. It has to be the best paragraph ever, and no way am I going to give it to you incomplete. So he completes this paragraph, he works through the night, he works through the morning, and he sits until daybreak and he composes this paragraph. Okay, I'm going to show it to you now. And just look at the picture that you get of the paragraph. So, ho John, and this is John Smith, how now, told you so, you know, don't crow another time before you're out of the woods. Now he's bringing in different idiomatic phrases, putting them all together because his aim is to put in the maximum number of O's in a paragraph. Does your mother know you're out? So a comment on John Smith's age and position. Does your mother know? Did you ask your mother for permission to go out? You know, small boys have to do that. Oh, no, no. So go home at once now, John, to your odious old woods of Concord. So John Smith has come from Concord, so he says, go back because you didn't ask for your mother's permission. Go home to your woods, old owl. Go, you won't? Oh, po, don't do so. So every word that he's using has an O in it, and this is what he writes because he's not convinced by John Smith's argument that he should be writing without using so many O's. So he says, you've got to go, you know, so go at once and don't go slow, for nobody owns you here, you know. So look, just try counting the number of O's here. You have dozens of them, and this is just one paragraph. So this paragraph is the one that Mr. Bullethead spends the whole night in composing. And he says, oh John, John, if you don't go, you're no homo. No, you're only a fowl, an owl, a cow, a sow, a doll, a poll, a poor old good-for-nothing to nobody log, dog, hog, or frog, come out of a concord bog. Cool, now cool, do be cool, you fool, none of your crowing old cock. Don't frown so, don't. Don't hollow, nor howl, nor growl, nor bow, wow, wow. Good Lord, John, how you do look. Okay, there's more. Told you so, you know, but stop rolling your goose of an old poll about so, and go and drown your sorrows in a bowl. So this 2.5 slides worth of a paragraph is what Mr. Bullethead sits up writing, and when he's composed it, the copy boy, or the person who has to put this into the press, gets this, but he only gets it in the morning. Now what happens is that the community of Alexander the Great Onopolis is waiting to see what response Mr. Bullethead is going to give to Mr. John Smith. So this is what he comes up with. Exhausted very naturally by so stupendous an effort, the great touch and go, that is Mr. Bullethead, could attend to nothing farther that night. So the whole night he was composing this one paragraph, and yet with an air of conscious power he handed his manuscript to the devil in waiting, which was the copy boy, the person who had to put it in the press, and then walking leisurely home, retired with dignity to bed. So when day broke and he had finally handed over that paragraph, he could go to sleep. Meantime, the devil, or the boy to whom he had given that paragraph to insert into the newspaper, he ran up the stairs to where he had the press, and he started to set the manuscript up so that it would have prominence in the newspaper, and the people could read it as soon as the newspaper was published. Now remember, you're talking about a small town with a limited population, and not the kind of distribution that, for example, you would expect in a place like Lahore or Karachi or Peshawar, where you have thousands of newspapers that have to be distributed. Here, this is a local newspaper. It is of interest only to the people in the town, and therefore people wait for the newspaper to come out and be read. And what happens here is that the first word was so. So when he is setting the type up, he needs different letters, and he plunges into the place where the S's should be, and he comes out with a capital S. But what happens after that? The very next letter is O. So what does he, what happens? What happens is that he cannot find an O. And he is so full of frustration and anger that he cannot type out an O. He types out a capital S, but he can't type an O. And this is where trouble comes in. There was no O. So he looks at the capital O and he finds out that he doesn't even have a capital O. Now what is he to do? This whole paragraph is based on the importance of the letter O, and he can't find any. So he says, what can I do? He rushes to the foreman and he says, I can't never set up nothing without no O's. Now here you see he's using double negatives together, but you get the meaning that he's saying that I can't find the letter O. And the foreman says, what do you mean by that? You know, the foreman is tired, he's sleepy, and he says, what are you trying to say? And the copy boy says, well, there bean't an O in the office, neither a big one nor a little one. So he can't find a capital O, he can't find a small O. What is he to do? And the foreman says, well, what has become of all those O's? And he says, I don't know. But I saw one of them Gazette devils prowling about here all night, and I suspect that he's gone and cabbaged, or he's gone and gotten hold of all of those O's. So because there is this rivalry going on, he says that I saw one of the Alexander the Great Annapolis Gazette boys here in the building, and I have a feeling that he has stolen all our O's. And the foreman says, Dod rot him, I haven't a doubt of it. So by this time the rivalry has grown to such an extent, the foreman believes that yes, somebody from the Gazette must have come and stolen all the O's. And he says, you know, what you need to do is that the smallest chance that you get, you should go and grab hold of all their eyes, and that will teach them a lesson. He says, yes, I'll do that. But what do we do with this paragraph? As he calls it, that air paragrab. Now you can imagine that the copy boy has a problem where his adenoids are acting up. He's got a nasal voice, he's got a blocked nose, and therefore instead of saying paragraph, he says paragrab. Like, you know, when your nose is all clogged up and you can't make certain sounds. So he says, you know, this paragraph has to go, else, you know, the editor is going to be very, very angry with us. And the foreman says, and not a bit of pitch hot. Is it a long paragraph, Bob? And Bob says, it's not a very long paragraph. And you see how Poe here uses the language of not only the uneducated, or what you would call the lower sections of society, but he uses, he writes words the way they are being pronounced. So you have a big problem here. There are no O's in the press, and they don't know what to do. The editor has gone home to sleep because he's been working all night, and now you have the foreman and the copy by Bob, and they have to make sure that the paper comes out. So the foreman says, how long is the paragraph? He doesn't know that the entire paragraph rests on the number of O's. So he says, use another letter. And Bob says, how can I do that? And he says, nobody's going to read this. So you go and you use another letter in place of O. And Bob, poor fellow, is just a copy boy. You know, he doesn't have a very important designation. but he has this work to do and he's afraid of Mr. Bullethead. So he says, all right, this is what I'm going to do. I have no choice. He says, I is to gouge out all their eyes, and damn all their gizzards. Well, this here's the chap as is just able for to do it. Now he's got his own way of expressing things, and he says, well, if I'm going to get the responsibility, I can deal with it, and it's not such a big problem, and I am the man to do this. So he goes there, and although he was only 12 years old and 4 feet high, he says, I am going to fight for my editor, and nobody is going to say that the paper didn't come out because the editor was not there. So, and here Poe makes an aside and says, this is something that that did not happen for the first time. Things like these happen, and you cannot account for them. And when this sort of thing happens, it is very usual to use the X in place of a letter. Now here Poe is making a reference to the fact that X is a letter that can be used anywhere. It's like the joker in a pack of cards. The joker can be used for anything. So the X can be used in place of any letter. But this is where they run into a problem, because there are so many O's here. And one of the reasons why they use the letter X is that you don't have many words in which X is used. Those of you, for example, who play word games like Scrabble will know that X has a very high value. In Scrabble, X will have the value of 8. But it's very difficult to come up with words that have X in them. So he has a lot of X's, and Bob thinks, I can do this. I can put a few X's in place of an O. So he says, I shall have to X this here paragrab. Now you get the connection between the story and the title, Xing the paragraph or Xing the paragraph. So he says, okay, I'll X this paragraph. And so what he did was he pushed an X for every O. Next morning, the population of Napolis were taken all aback by reading in the teapot this particular paragraph. And I want you to look at this paragraph and see if you can make any sense out of it. You have so many X's. You have SX, HX, JXHN, HXW, NXW. There are no vowels. O was the vowel that Mr. Bullethead had used, and when you substitute an X with it, the entire shape of the paragraph changes. Look at this slide. Look at the way that the paragraph has changed. It doesn't make any sense at all. And so the people started to wonder what it was. They couldn't understand what had happened. And there was an uproar. The first idea that came to the mind of the population was that this was a code, and that Mr. Bullethead had written a code and there was some secret message in it. So there was a mad rush towards Mr. Bullethead's residence because people wanted to ask him what he had written. But they couldn't find the gentleman anywhere. and they have not been able to find him since. So when they rushed towards Mr. Bullethead's residence, it was with the idea that they would catch hold of Mr. Bullethead, wake him, shake him, and get him to tell them what he had written. They understood what was going on between Mr. John Smith and Mr. Bullethead. But this last paragraph was beyond them. Unable to discover its legitimate object, the popular fury at length subsided, leaving behind it quite a medley of opinion about this unhappy affair. So when they couldn't find Mr. Bullethead, they started wondering what the message was supposed to be. One gentleman thought the whole an excellent joke, so now they're focusing on the X. Another said that indeed Bullethead had shown much exuberance of fancy, another X. A third admitted that he was eccentric, but no more. A fourth could only suppose that the Yankees designed to express his exasperation because he's coming from the East, from the eastern states. The western states, in any case, did not have any strong emotional attachment to the states of the East. So they said, you know, this is a Yankee, this is somebody coming from the East, he doesn't know any better, and that is why he's put in so many X's. A fifth person says that, you know, he's trying to set an example to posterity. So each opinion has an X in it. That Bullethead had been driven to an extremity was clear to all, and in fact, since that editor could not be found, there was some talk about lynching the other one. So when they could not find Mr. Bullethead, the town was so excited, so exasperated, that they said it's because of Mr. John Smith that this has happened, so let us go and lynch him, let's go and hang him. But the more common conclusion was that the affair was extraordinary and inexplicable. X, everybody knew, was an unknown quantity. Those of you who've studied algebra will have seen that you're always told to find X. And in this case, it was not just X that was an unknown quantity, but there was an unknown quantity of X's. That is, there were so many X's that there was no way that the population could see what was to be done with it. So the one person that they did not consult was Bob, the copy boy, the one who had put all those X's in. And if anybody had talked to him, they would have been told that because Mr. Bullethead did not drink like ordinary people, and he had this special alcoholic drink, that is the XXX ale, that was what had caused him to put in, to have such a temperament that led to this whole town being exasperated and this confusion and chaos being caused. But nobody paid any attention to Bob because nobody thought that he had a part to play in it. But what Poe, as writer, as narrator, says is that the one person who could have answered their questions, they never bothered to ask. They didn't pay any attention to what he was saying, because after all, he was only 4 feet high and he was only 12 years old. So who is going to ask a 12-year-old boy what the editor wanted to write? So that's enough for today. Let me quickly recap what we have done. This is Xing a paragraph. It's the story of 2 editors in a very small town, great rivals. One of them starts a kind of battle by using the letter O a lot. The other retaliates and says that you don't know how to write because you're using the O all the time, and you don't write a word that doesn't have an O in it. And Mr. Bullethead, who's just come from one of the eastern states into this small western town, he takes up that challenge and says, okay, I'm going to write a paragraph that has O in every word. So he sits up the whole night, he writes that paragraph, but what happens in the morning is when he has gone home, the copy boy discovers that when he wants to publish or to print the paper, he can't find an O in the typeset. So he asks the foreman, they come to this decision, there's just the two of them by that time. Remember, it's a very small town, it's a small newspaper, there's only two people on duty there, the foreman and the copy boy. So the foreman says, use any other letter because it's probably been stolen by the rival newspaper. Because the decision is left to the copy boy says, I can do this, I am a fighter, we will not allow the other newspaper, that is the Gazette, to beat us, so I am going to use a letter that I find in abundance. And he finds the letter X in abundance because X is very seldom used. It's a letter that is not just seldom, but it's a letter that is very rarely used. And so in place of all those O's, he writes the X's. Now when he writes the X's and the newspaper comes out, there is an uproar in the town because nobody can understand what the writer or the editor is trying to say. So everybody rushes to Mr. Bullethead's house and they find out that he's gone. Now the mystery is, what does the paragraph mean? So different people have different opinions. They give their opinions. Nobody bothers to ask that 12-year-old boy if he knows anything. And it's actually the doing of the 12-year-old boy which has such a strong impact on the entire town. And when the townspeople cannot find Mr. Bullethead, their first decision is that John Smith, the editor of the Alexander the Great Annapolis Gazette, is to be blamed for this battle starting, and so he should be lynched, he should be hanged. And then of course other people talk to them and they say, no, we cannot lynch him, we should not hang him. But nobody in that whole town bothers to ask that 12-year-old boy the reason for this. Because if somebody had asked him, the reason that he would have given is that because Mr. Bullethead came from the eastern states, he could not settle into this community. He was not really welcomed, and one of the reasons why he was not welcomed is because he didn't drink what was locally produced. He drank a particular quality of ale, and because it was a XXX ale, so Bob thinks that it's all those X's that are the reasons for Mr. Bullethead having such a bad temper and starting this entire argument and entire issue of having two newspapers in a very small town. What the writer or what Edgar Allan Poe winds up with is that X is a letter that is very frequently asked for. Those of you who've studied algebra will remember that you are asked, find X. These are the features of other letters, you have to find X. And X is always an unknown quantity. Here he says that it's not just X that is an unknown quantity, there is an unknown quantity of X, because there are so many X's that Bob the copywriter puts into that paragraph, which drives the whole town mad. I've really enjoyed reading this story, and I hope that you will have enjoyed it too. So take care of yourselves. Thank you for being very patient, and for now, Allah Hafiz.